right, thank you. Well, I am very grateful to be here today and to be able to share with you about a project taking place at the Dawes Arboretum in collaboration with American Electric Power and the Electric Power Research Institute. We are exploring the seeding of native prairie plantings and rights-of-ways, not only to create more functional landscapes, but also to increase habitat restoration on a regional scale. So to get us started, maybe. Well, I don't know. Maybe we're going to get started here. Any tips? Aha! Magic. Just to give you guys an overview of the Dawes Arboretum, we are best known for our living collections of plants from around the world. We have over 16,000 labeled plants, but perhaps less known is the fact that we have 2,000 acres, and much of which is dedicated to ecological restoration and research. And it is our commitment to conservation and restoration that really led for us to explore this project. And the initial goal was really just about establishing feasibility. You know, would native plantings grow in this context? And based on previous experience, confident that it would, the goal here was really to demonstrate feasibility, practicality of the approach, and also to, if successful, provide solutions not only for the industry, but also for conservation community as well. So at the end of the day, what we were aiming for are functional landscapes, not only from a management perspective, but also from an ecological function as well. So why use prairie as a reference ecosystem? There are a number of reasons. We'll probably hear about them throughout the day. But especially compared to the traditional non-native seeding approach, obviously native forbs provide greater pollination services because they're co-evolved with the insects that depend on them. They are able to grow in a variety of soil conditions and even very difficult soils. No fertilizations required. Once they're established, they're very drought tolerant, and that's due to the extensive root systems that stabilize the soil, as Chip mentioned earlier. So this isn't the first time this concept has been proposed. There's actually been, for a number of years, native seedings used throughout the country in rights-of-ways, abandoned mine lands, and oil and gas reclamation, which we're going to hear about later in the conference. Yet another really great reason to consider prairie as a revegetation strategy is because it is one of the most endangered large ecosystems in North America. If we consider the fact that it used to cover almost a third of the country, and now most of that is gone due to development, primarily agriculture, but also various forms of disturbance, most of it will not return. And so we have this opportunity on degraded lands or disturbed sites to essentially recreate prairie where it once belonged, but also in areas that don't stand a chance to ever be recreated into prairie. We have an opportunity to offset those losses into new lands. And from my own experience, this dated back to projects that we began on surface mine lands at a institute called The Wilds, a conservation center in Ohio, and really experimented with using native plants in that context and saw a lot of great success. That led us to work with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources and the Division of Mineral Resource Management, and we were able to see success on abandoned mine lands, simply using native seeds in the reclamation process. And we were very encouraged by those results as well, and that's what led us to explore the new project that I'm going to refer to today, which is really about exploring the use of power line prairies. And I mention this because, at least from my own perspective, it was experimentation across those industries that really led to refinement of the approach, and is really about learning from the past to help make a plan for the future. So land degradation, habitat loss, development, however you want to frame it, is not going to be ending anytime soon. It's a fact of our reality. And so we also need to kind of shift our paradigm. So returning perhaps to that original ecological state is not even necessarily realistic in many cases, for example, in minelands. And, you know, our standard practice of using non-native vegetation to reseed these sites, we know it has a limited ecological value in comparison. And so I guess what I would propose is that these provide new opportunities for restoration, perhaps differently when we thought about them in the past. But we also know that that has the potential to increase ecological structure and function. And I think the real obvious next step in terms of prioritization is anytime we are creating a bare ground condition, whether that be new construction, whether that be line upgrades, whatever the case may be, those are the low-hanging fruit, the obvious priorities in terms of using native seeding instead of the traditional approach. And it's because we've seen success. Of course, there are other examples where rather than habitat creation, we are looking at habitat conversion. So taking existing vegetation, removing it intentionally with the goal in mind of converting it to prairie cover. In 2015, the Arboretum partnered with the Ohio Department of Transportation, who you'll hear from later today, to establish an area into a native planting. And the goal here was, of course, to enhance pollinator habitat, but also to reduce maintenance costs. So we worked with them on designing a seed mix, and this was just in the second growing season. So I think it established quite well. Give you guys another idea. At that same time, we decided we wanted to establish a companion plot at the Arboretum. This is just down the road from the site I just showed you. And it kind of demonstrates one of the challenges we see with establishment, which is the intent. It may not always be obvious, so it can take time for these sites to develop. And it wasn't until our third year that it became obvious to the public and to our guests that this site had actually been transformed into a more beneficial cover. So clearly more beneficial from a pollination standpoint here as well. So that was what led us to really want to explore this a little further with exploring power line prairies and using rights-of-ways as an additional opportunity to create prairie habitat. This project was established in 2015. This is what it looked like the following growing season after planting, and this next slide will show you what it looked like the year after that. So you can see there was a shift in species that were dominant, so we know we can expect a change over time. Our big goal here was to design a mix, of course, that would establish, but also it was based on economy. So we wanted to find a mix that was affordable, had the greatest number of species, so maximum diversity for the lowest cost. And we also knew that we needed to rely on hardy native species that could thrive in a variety of conditions, so we needed to design a mix that was flexible and not necessarily tailored to a low wet site or a high dry site. And of course, part of our strategy was including annual flowering crops as part of the cover crop. Those cues were taken from some of that experience I referenced in working in abandoned mine lands. And what we saw there was that not all native species were necessarily ideal candidates for reseeding projects. We really needed to rely on hardy native species that we knew would survive a variety of conditions. At the end of the day, we know they have to be competitive. So what grew? I don't expect you to actually be able to read all of these species. The important part is right up here at the top, which was to say that at the end of our third growing season, so really 2 years later, but the end of the third growing season, we saw 13 of the 19 species that were seeded, and that was 68% of the species in the mix. So we felt encouraged by that, and that was really what led us to establish the expansion project of exploring power line prairies in 2017. The project goals were an add-on. As we had our proof of concept, we decided to say we really wanted to not only evaluate a species establishment, obviously we want to know what's growing, but we also wanted to look at potential for soil erosion control and stability, measure tree invasion, and also document the diversity of the species using the site. Ultimately, our goal is to help develop recommendations, which is the same thing. I think most of us are here today so that we can have the go-to guide for vegetation establishment and management. This is an overview of what the plots look like. So you can see there are two different sites. On the left-hand side, we have the agricultural setting, and on the right is in a forested corridor. So first we're going to start with the forested corridor, and I'll walk you through some of the site preparation and the planting technique we use there. This is what the site looked like just prior to planting. So not necessarily ideal for a utility rights-of-ways, mostly woody vegetation that would need to be maintained and obviously potentially causing some maintenance issues there. Our next step was to replicate construction. So we created what we would call pseudo pads, and about the size of typical impact when a line is either upgraded or a new line is installed. So essentially the area was cleared of vegetation. We demarcated these pads of 100 feet by 100 feet, 3 of those sites. And this is what it looked like. There was no special preparation. As you could see the track marks from the dozer. It was compacted. There was no herbicide used in the removal, simply removing the vegetation. Then because of the size of the site, we decided to broadcast our seed using the hand broadcast method at 14 pounds per acre bulk seed. So that resulted in about 8 pounds per acre pure live seed. Then we put this clean straw mulch down, as you would at any site that was receiving seed, to reduce soil erosion potential. And when we rolled it in with a cultipactor to get good seed-to-soil contact. This is what it looked like 1 year and 1 month later. So we were really happy to see that the vegetation did establish. I'm going to walk you through that again. This is what it looked like after preparation, following the straw mulch, and then finally in the first growing season after it was planted. So as you can see, I think definitely a better result going from this to this, and from not only a management perspective in terms of functionality, but also from a pollination standpoint and habitat. This is clearly more beneficial, more forbs, and better ecological resources. So now I'm going to share with you the results of the project that we explored looking at agricultural field establishment. We used a different approach for this. From a seeding perspective, we used a no-till drill and drilled that into an existing cover of the previous year's crop residue. And you might wonder, okay, if you've got a productive farm field, why would you want to convert that into pollination cover? And I think there's plenty of research out of other institutions that are showing that there can be additional benefits by providing pollinator buffer strips around existing croplands, but also what we are seeing in our areas, some areas are really not productive due to the being high erosion prone, and so there are lots of reasons why we might want to explore this as well. This is what the site looked like after the first growing season, and maybe difficult to see, but there's actually a line right down the center of this. And this shows the difference in management approach. We did decide to mow half of the plots while leaving the other half of the plots unmowed to really understand the impact and potential management implications for mowing versus not mowing. So you can really see, can anyone guess the site that was mowed? You can shout it out. Yeah, it was this side. So mowing really made a huge impact in terms of the species diversity and the end result of what we were seeing. So what grew in these plots? Well, we took a close look. We used 2 different techniques, a standard technique of the Daubenmeier method, but also a more intensive method using the North Carolina Vegetation Survey at more intensive scales. And I'm sure everybody can read this, especially those in the back, right? Not really important. We can look at it afterwards if you'd like, but this is what I was really happy to see. This is at the end of our second growing season. We had 72% of the species that were seeded, and again, that was really just a year and several months later after seeding. So again, we're really encouraged by what we see here, and this was our goal of increasing diversity from the previous example that I showed you of 25 species. So we knew it grew, which was great, but we were also interested in the functionality from a soil erosion standpoint. So, of course, we used the sort of standard. The low bar would be 70% coverage within a year. Obviously, that's the bare minimum. I'm happy to say the plot had 80% coverage within 4 weeks. So from the perspective of whether or not this is a useful technique to ensure we're protecting soil and waterways, the exclusively native mix was 100% effective in meeting that objective for vegetation. This is just an up-close look at some of the evaluation for the erosion control measure in the study. So our other objective was really about understanding whether or not native prairie plantings have an ability to inhibit or reduce tree establishment. And the end result is, at this point, is a 5-year study, and we're 2 years in, so we need more time to really be able to measure that. But our study, along with others, really suggests that by providing a diverse mix that is sufficiently dense, but asterisk here by, not too dense, because it can cause native density-dependent mortality, is really part of the key to limiting resource availability for not only trees, but invasives that will come into the site. So we know that by including some species that may have an inhibitory effect on their own, which are some research to suggest that, but I think equally important is including native flowering annuals in the mix and using them as a cover crop can really be a great strategy to occupying that space to essentially take away opportunities for trees and invasives to start to colonize the site. So at this point, what we can say is we don't have any evidence to suggest that native plantings promote or increase tree establishment. So we know that it is either equal to or potentially better than seeding non-natives. We're all here because we recognize that rights of ways are important habitat. We have our whole event is dedicated to that. So I'll just share with you some of the results of our wildlife surveys. We found that 8 genera of bees were using the habitat within the first season of growing. 27 species of butterflies and skippers, that's cumulative, and then 32 species of birds. So right away, wildlife found the site. If you build it, they will come. My presentation would not be complete if I did not have a lovely picture of a monarch butterfly using our habitat, so here it is. We all recognize the importance of rights of ways as potentially serving to support monarch populations, and I believe strongly is definitely part of the solution, as was discussed already and will be further. So if saving and then potentially endangered species isn't reason enough, there is also a business case for considering the use of native seed mixes. There's a lot going on this slide. So what I want to do is actually just walk us up from the bottom. So this is to demonstrate that whether you are using a traditional seeding mix or a native seeding mix, traditional non-native mix versus native, a lot of the practices are the same. So in terms of the requirements, but when you look at using a native seeding approach, there are already innately cost savings because lime and fertilizer are not required for native cover. And so really what it kind of comes down to is seed cost. And we're going to talk a lot about this, and there are going to be other people to cover it much more in depth. But we'll just use this as a point of reference. So this scale is not based on our research. It is based on this published study that was a pretty extensive cost-benefit analysis of using native plants over multiple scales. So pretty reliable, but what it shows is even if we just took the average, the middle point, and said $3 per pound and applied that, that's $300 per acre compared to $382. So you're talking about a difference of $82 with tremendous benefits provided by the native plant cover over using a non-native approach. And so, and that is really, as I said, sort of not taken into account the cost savings that we recognize from having no need for fertilizer or lime. And then also, this is a mix that was actually a little bit on the higher side compared to some others I've seen. with increased diversity typically comes increased cost. So I think there's a happy medium to be found there. Last thing I'll mention is just about rate. And I'm sure we'll be discussing other projects that would suggest a lower rate can be effective. And I think that is also somewhat site dependent. But for the most part, based on a lot of different projects we've looked at, we're seeing this is bulk pounds per acre. This can be an effective rate to get good establishment and at the same time avoid the potential for investing too much in that seed. So we've talked a lot about the benefits, but we should also visit the challenges and talk about some of the solutions. So yeah, seed cost and variability kind of being one of the major sticking points. And I believe you're going to hear later today from Joel Hunt. He is with the Ohio Department of Transportation. And one thing they've done, which I think is really smart, is to work on an RFP bid process, which really allows companies and industry to take control of the process by having more stability in the budget forecast. And it also helps with designing these flexible seed mixes. And what I mean by that is not a seed mix that is really, really specific, that is only going to work in a wet site. That picture I showed you was one mix, but we saw a clear differentiation between the plants that would succeed and the site that was most conducive for them. So that's another strategy there. Another issue being that flowering maturation time, sometimes taking up to 3 years for a lot of species. But as I showed you in those photos, there are plenty of 1- and 2-year bloomers that can be specifically selected to provide and occupy that early niche, so that while your longer growing perennials are taking time to establish these really robust root systems, you have the flowering annuals and some of these 1- and 2-year early blooming species to be able to provide that early cover and success for the long range. The other thing I'll mention too is about seed rate and ratio. There are some studies that are supporting seed to grass, a forb to grass ratio of somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 50. I'm sure we'll hear lots more about that later. But also not seeding too heavy and not seeding too light is, I think, key to healthy establishment. Also understanding that sites change through time. It's important to set that expectation up from the beginning so that people understand that you're going to go through an ugly duckling phase before you get to the swan. And then lastly, I kind of want to visit management. So mow management versus no mow management. So no mow management sites will certainly still support some natives, but will offer less diversity for the most part. Our goal here in this study was to really understand management impacts as well. So what we're seeing is that mowing in the first year is really critical, and that is sort of almost the bare minimum if you really want to have solid establishment. And we saw those obvious differences in our plots. If herbicide management is going to be the only tool, we do know that herbicide selectivity can be built into some of these mixes, and I think there are some folks exploring that. And then also, once there's healthy establishment of those forbs and grasses, when woodies are sprayed out, then they're able to recolonize those open spaces if the native plants surrounding them are healthy. If there's going to be no mono management or herbicide management, that's certainly not ideal. Because while some native plants will persist, and we do know this from sites that have essentially received no management, it's going to really reduce the potential benefits and reduce the ability for that site to repel trees from invasion if those spaces are not occupied with the species that you do want. So just sort of a recap of some of the benefits that we can see from using revegetation with native seed. We see that it does stabilize soil, which in turn protects watersheds. It is able to provide cover in a variety of difficult growing conditions. It certainly creates habitat regionally, both where it was essentially established, but also in areas where it is an offset to where it may never be able to be restored again. It certainly increases native species present on the land, and it helps to increase our ecosystem function better than non-native species. In comparison, it is comparable in terms of cost and performance, and it builds our natural capital over time. And lastly, and maybe even more importantly from an implementation standpoint and practicality, it is financially sustainable because we've shown that establishment costs early on are essentially the same, and potentially you have cost savings over time with reduced maintenance. So at the end of the day, you know, our project, we're really excited about it and the potential it has to help inform others. I'm really excited to hear from the other presenters today about some of the lessons learned, but we believe it works and creates healthier landscapes and provides these practical outcomes that are important to everyone. And it does conserve resources, not only natural resources, but also financial resources as well. And with that, I'd like to thank all the folks who helped make this project possible. I don't know if we have any time for questions.
Why don't we take one question, if anyone has one.
Go ahead.
Would love to have seen the difference. And you might already have mentioned it, and it just didn't catch it, but the timing of the mowing after the seeding, what would be the best timing to mow?
Well, in an ideal world, because obviously I understand that it is not always ideal when the seed needs to go down, maybe dependent on the construction and the disturbance of the site, but if you had an ideal world in which that seeding could take place in the late spring, the mowing should take place before, in Ohio anyway, we sort of aim for Memorial Day. But the seeding that I showed you was actually seeded later in the season. It was early June and mowed in an unideal time, traditionally speaking, towards the end of actually early July. And typically speaking, that's really kind of late and can stress those plants, but it still performed. And so in a way, we sort of looked back and reflected that was beneficial to, even if you're applying the technique in a less than ideal circumstance, it can still result in a positive outcome. So I would say it would be probably different for other locations, but for us it's that late May, early June time frame, if you've gotten your seed in early enough.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.